I know what is in the river. We know they're down there. It was October. A cold and dreary one. The first one went missing a day before Halloween. Maybe 2 days before, I'm not sure. She was a young girl, around 15. Her name was Cassie Nanton. My mother was good friends with her parents, so I felt some personal investment because my mother was devastated. However, that personal investment is what deterred the sheriff from letting me help in the search. The sheriff is not a bad person by any means, but she has this idea that officers with personal attachment shouldn't be involved. Says she saw too many good deputies make mistakes cause the suspect or victim was their sibling or lover. Marcus, she tried to comfort me. I know you want to help, but I feel you're becoming too focused on doing this for your mother. And that is admirable. But I need some men to stay in town to watch things while Hector and I lead the search. Understand? Yes, ma'am, I responded. She could tell I didn't mean it. But I still followed orders anyways. That was until the 5th person went missing. At the 6th, every single deputy and person in town was searching. At the 8th, a few started staying at home scared. It was the 9th missing person. It was the end of November at this point when the smell started to drift into the woods. It took me a day to find the source. It was the river. Usually, around this time the river would be frozen up. But this year was much warmer than normal. The river was a good few miles away from town. Normally that makes the river perfect for canoeing and fishing, but the townspeople don't use it at all. Hell, until this point I had forgotten it had even existed. I was at the river bank with another cop named Leo Keffer and a schoolteacher who knew some students that had gone missing. Mrs. Anderson, I think her name was. We all had managed to stand the smell at first, but Leo at some point left. Anderson stayed though, not much longer, but I can't blame either of them. At first, I didn't want to just assume the smell's origin. As a cop, you never should just assume anything. But after another 20 minutes of patrolling the sandy edge of the dark river that seemed to stretch infinitely across the planet, I found a necklace. It was made of a light silver chain with a green jewel joining the strand. The jade was encased in a bright, gold casing. It belonged to a 24-year-old woman, the 4th disappearance. Her name was Katie Ann. I brought the necklace to the sheriff. She asked where I found this. I told her the river and suggested that we try to somehow get a dive team set up to search for potential bodies in the river. I was gonna start searching for a diving or salvage crew to hire, maybe call in the FBI when she stopped me. You sure it was by the river? She asked softly, in a voice that only reached my ears. Yes, ma'am. Also, it smells out by the river. Smells rancid. I think there might be bodies in or nearby the river. She looked at the necklace again and placed it in her pocket. She called up Hector, who was basically second in command at the station. She whispered into his ear. He went off out of the station. Marcus, she turned to me. I want you to stop searching, especially by that river. Hector is going to tell the others to halt searches as well. I was baffled. I will admit to my mistake of getting very upset. Why stop the searches? We have to check the river, I exclaimed. I felt an uneasy air in the room. I think it was me mentioning the river. The word stuck itself into other deputies' heads. I was sent home, but I kept searching on my own. The 11th went missing. He was a schoolboy, only 6 years old. But at this point, they still weren't searching. The sheriff knew they were in that river. So do I. But I had to see for myself. I bought a video camera, a really expensive one that was built to work underwater in other stressful situations. The idea was to put the camera down with a light to try and record the bodies down there. Maybe find a cause to all of this. The camera went down pretty far from what I could tell. Deeper than the biggest numbers people gave me for the river. The camera would take a few days to process the footage in high definition. So till then, I continued monitoring the river. 13 were now missing. This is when people started moving away, at least those that could afford it. That day I found more missing items on the riverbed. Pocket watches, baseballs, shoes of all sizes. I didn't bother sending them to the sheriff. She had already fired me after someone spotted me by the river. 15 now gone. I was searching the riverbanks when I found a ring in the dirt. I didn't take much to it until I picked it up and saw my parents' initials on it. My mother never took off her ring since my father passed. I fell to the earth. I tore into the grass and dirt and ripped it apart. I turned to the cold, murky waters that danced and bobbed. The river's stillness was gone. The river at this point revealed itself to me as what it truly was. A monster. With anger and desperation, I made the nearly fatal error. I tried diving down into the river, but my eyes stung when I entered. I resurfaced and screamed in pain. I felt myself falling. Not sinking, falling. Sinking is slow, it takes time to sink. Falling is gravity pushing you down with quick and merciless force. That's what I felt. Like I took a wrong step on the trail and my foot had fallen into a hidden hole in the underbrush. I quickly leaped for the riverbed. I was completely submerged, but I held onto a root in the bed. My eyes still stung, but I could manage to keep them open. I looked below me. I knew the river was deep. Some said it was about 12 feet, some even claimed 20. But I didn't see a bottom. In the middle of the riverbed, it sloped into a deep canyon. Half of my body was dangling in the open space above the gap, and I started climbing carefully. When I returned to the bank, my body broke. In the river, it felt like my whole body was being crushed, like the planet's gravity had doubled if not tripled. 18 gone, my mother included. Her home showed no sign of a struggle or any break-in. The doors were just unlocked. The camera finally processed. At this point, I was preparing to leave town as well. The sheriff was preparing to call in the National Guard after more members of the police force disappeared, including Hector. I wanted to just break the damn thing, delete the files, burn it all. But I had to know. It's clear the sheriff knew something. Some people in this wretched town knew something. I wanted to know. I had to know. So, the night before I left, I booted up the footage and watched what the camera found in the river's canyon. The camera was slowly spinning as it went past the first part of the bank and began descending into the dark abyss that was hidden so well under the dirty currents. The camera was closer to one side of the canyon, the light attached to it illuminating the dirt walls. Eventually, it turned to brownish stone. I saw holes and crevices lining the wall, the light only scratching the mouth of the dark interiors. I was focused on the screen, trying to see if I could spot any body parts in the hole when something slapped the camera. I jumped back, assuming it must have been a fish. But as I looked, I saw the object flailing around. The camera gained some distance as the whole thing came into view. It was a human arm. The skin was wrinkled against the bones. Like the muscle and flesh was taken out and the skin was placed back around the bone like a glove. The hand's ring and pinky finger were missing, bits of ripped skin dangling from where they once were. The camera moved further down. I had assumed the arm was moving from the current. But as the camera showed what it was attached to, I realized. It was alive. The arm was dug partially into the wall, where only a few inches, a skull and ribcage protruded from the rock. The skull's half-broken jaw moved up and down, like it was saying something. Like the arm, a thin layer of rotted skin covered the skull while the ribcage's skin was torn between the jagged ribs. I thought I could see what looked like shriveled organs inside. The arm was reaching out for the camera. It looked desperate. The camera spun away as it lowered. When reaching back to the wall, I saw more rotted limbs and faces. As it spun farther to the right, I saw hundreds of bodies. The 18 weren't the first. God, how long has it been doing this? What was doing this? This was why I had pulled the camera up, unaware what was happening at the time. I was quick to leave the next day. After an hour or two of driving, I got called that the town was being evacuated by government officials. The sheriff had disappeared. I didn't react much on the call. But that night I broke down, unable to sleep as I imagined my mother, Hector, the sheriff, and all the others, children being turned into lifeless husks. I don't know how it did it. But I know, after months of sleepless nights, that the river was behind it. Somehow, it got every last one of them. and it had been around for a long time and will still be there, waiting.
Kushtaka keep me from my river. I grew up along the river. The water ran clear, sometimes. The water ran steady, sometimes. The water was true in its route, sometimes. The river was tricky in that manner. Even my family would be wary of it and check every day where it would go next. I was never allowed on the river. At least not alone. Having a single father in the middle of nowhere, Alaska, isn't so bad. With 4 siblings and a village to raise me, it didn't appear any different to any other home. Scratch that, 4 half-siblings. I ended up somewhere in the middle of 2 marriages. It seemed my father had terrible luck with women. Or more so, terrible luck with his wives. Though that's entirely another story. The oldest 2 were from his first marriage. 2 beautiful girls, one with big green eyes, the other blue. You could tell their mother was white like my dad. The younger 2 were from his current wife, who was also native Alaskan like my mother. Sharp cheekbones and that native girl look other people would call resting bitch face. Really, we can't help that that's where our faces naturally rest. One was my age, she was from my stepmom's first marriage, and the other only a couple years younger than me. There was me, right in the middle. Born outside of marriage, not uncommon. What was the kicker was my birth, immediate abandonment, and my mother disappearing from the hospital, leaving me alone. Not that I hold anything against her. I regularly think, my poor father and 6 women. No wonder he's a bush pilot and does the mail run. Growing up, I had my oldest sibling who was old enough to watch all of us. We would play in the woods if we weren't working. What? You think we get out of chores just because we're children? We were at home in the woods and not even the animals scared us. We learned how to sight their movement, feel them watching, and smell them early enough we could make it to the safety of our home. And when our senses failed, we were able to depend on our dogs to warn and shepherd us at the first sign of trouble. Still, no matter how familiar we were with the woods, we'd hear my stepmom sometimes yell at the other girls, "Keep you sister away from the river." We never listened. We knew her warning was to not leave me alone by the river. We really didn't know what the big deal was at the time. Our summers would pass this way, with us constantly dirty, covered in bug bites, racing through the woods, and splashing on the river's edge. I must have finally been about 14 at the time. I'd graduated from small tasks like mending nets that were better suited for small, dexterous hands, to chopping and hauling wood and preparing for hunting/trapping season. My oldest sister and I drew the short straw that day and were stuck with pre-season trapping preparation. My sister and I would regularly shoot glares at the other 3 running around. The second oldest running for fresh water, the younger 2 tending to the nets, dogs, or helping with hauling fish. It seemed like it would be a normal enough day of chatting about how cute the Cole boys were, or if we'd seen Auntie leaving a new uncle's home. Under our words, though, we had an agreement that something wasn't right. We sat facing each other to watch our backs, and we'd strain our ears during lulls in conversation. We couldn't bring ourselves to say anything, though. The dogs were still silent. Perhaps we were paranoid after the bear coming through the area 2 days ago. But to acknowledge whatever was there could be our undoing from spirits. By mid-afternoon, our sisters were worn out enough we would be conscripted to hauling salmon and cleaning them by the river, even with our hands raw. It was years of repetition. Split up stomach, slice alongside, flip, slice other side, toss the head and innards of every other into the river. The youngest had the joys of harvesting the eggs and sperm sacs of the carcasses we threw at them. The oldest and I were racing, and I had made the lead as the others took turns cleaning and running the buckets to the house or wherever the final prep locations were. To our dismay, when 2 of us finally finished up, none of our other siblings kept count. We rinsed our hands in the river as the other girls cleaned up our stations for the night. My older sister went to help, and I took the time to continue soothing my ravaged hands. I had nicked myself on traps earlier on in the day and still miffed about it. The silence in the woods was a relief. I finally had a moment alone for the first time in a while as all of our gear was brought to camp. I took sips of water and soon felt something wrong. The skin on my arms prickled as the feeling of being watched returned. I listened closely to the surroundings, bringing my head up and slowly scanning up and down the river before shifting on my heels to check behind me. Nothing. Then I realized that what felt wrong was I was alone by the river. Silly me, it was nothing more than the eeriness of a new experience in the woods. I shook my head and made my shoulders relax. There was no reason to be afraid of being alone by the river. I stood, wiping dirt off of myself and doing one last scan, then practically fell over. I saw a man standing across the river. An absolutely beautiful man who gave me a sly grin. The hair on the back of my neck rose. Not many came along the offshoot of the Yukon to where our camp was, never mind his nudity. Aside from his presence and the fact he was naked, what gave me the chills were his eyes. There was no definition between his iris and pupil, and the whites were barely visible. I looked behind me and none of my family was around. Turning back, another man was suddenly there, and I kept an eye for further movement. The only other living creatures were flashes of salmon in the clear water and beavers swimming along the river's edge. I swallowed back the call to them I felt coming to my throat. I'd be breaking Hutlani and there'd be no coming back from their acknowledgement. Something about the way the river had begun to slow and move lazily along brought another edge to my fear and affirmed my suspicions. I began a diagonal retreat, still managing to catch on a root. Regaining my footing, I looked up. There was now another man, now on my side of the river. From this side and a brief breeze, I could smell something. It was a familiar animal smell, but I couldn't take the time to decipher it. I bit my lip and held in the urge to turn and run. I could now see hair in different places, the sides of the legs and up the shins, spreading down to the shoulders from his hair, thick on the forearms. They were all clearly individuals like any other person: brown hair, black hair, tall, average. The only thing that remained the same among them were the smiles and smirks. I wasn't sure if they were mischievous or insidious. Their grins were taunting and their eyes flashed a strange playfulness. It was like they were calling me to a game on the playground, but hadn't told me the rules yet. My eyes flicked to the movement on the other side of the river where the first two slid into the water. The next thing I knew, two beavers began swimming across the river before the two men climbed out on my side. Now, Central Alaska Couchtakas are known for being tricksters. It can either be in fun or lead you to your death. They also have a really bad habit of stealing women. I felt every muscle of mine tense as I remember my elders warning us to stay away from shapeshifters. While not always bad, their tricks could be deadly dangerous. My slow retreat continued for minutes with them moving casually and smoothly. The hair stood on my neck and wafts of their familiar but alien scent would cause my skin to crawl. Eventually the men stopped staring and smirking before turning back toward the river. It seemed they'd grown disinterested and began talking low amongst themselves, and one even laughed. They cast one last glance my way and left. Even as I watched their backs moving away and eventually them sitting on the water's edge, I didn't turn from the river. I moved slowly, one step at a time toward safety. Soon enough my youngest sister called for me and I instinctively turned to her, struggling to tell her to run. Before I could even make a noise, they were suddenly moving unnaturally fast in the corner of my eyes and I couldn't get the words out fast enough. I was cut off as she yelled, "Rosemary! Come on, we have to hang these fish." I sprinted as hard as I could through the little remaining woods, not bothering with caution. I managed to tackle my youngest sister with a hand over her mouth. Breathing heavily, I stared through the woods, back to the river where I saw nothing but the calm, flowing water. The men had disappeared and not an unfamiliar splash could be found. I received weird looks from my sisters all night after my story, but the berating my stepmother gave them and me wouldn't leave our minds for years to come. Still, it wasn't the strangest part or the end of the debacle. The next day we woke to an unusual sight. The riverbank was completely washed out to the first line of trees. My stepmother gripped my shoulder tightly when she saw what had happened to the river, and it was almost as if she blamed me. I was never left alone by the river again. I was finally 20. I had run away from the woods and was living in the city, going to college. I had shed my wild times in the woods for another form of wild time in the city. I returned home only for holidays and ran to the city as soon as I could. It was at this point I had forgotten our ways and attributed our stories to that. Just stories to make children behave or give adults an out for vile behavior. This day happened on one of my summer breaks. It was so many years later I'd forgotten about my childhood experience. I remembered there was a year when the riverbank was badly washed out and nothing more. I squatted by the river, humming as I cleaned my fish knife. It was an old song I had been taught. I remember few words as I never truly focused on the language my grandmothers and aunts taught. Only the meaning stuck. A woman was singing, longing for her lover to come back to her. He had hunted across the frozen water and down river only for it to thaw. He wasn't able to return to her from his island he was stranded on, and she attempted to canoe over to him during the summer. The river wouldn't allow it, and she remained on our side upriver while he was never able to return. I had asked once why he just didn't come back in the winter, and I received a grave look and silence. Some women went back to beating, and a few others told me it was because the river swallowed them. The river swallows in many ways. That's when I felt the prickles on my skin and my ears felt warm. I flipped my eyes to the side to find nothing. Still, an unfamiliar animal was hunting. I continued humming and pulled my knife closer and once again scanned the world around me. As before, nothing. I still couldn't deny something was there that shouldn't be. At first I noticed a scent that could be a part of the woods and river. A stronger note of birch and pine. Then the subtlety of moss and lichen on lower trees. I knew we didn't have lichen in this part of the river for a while longer. My mind wrapped around these top scents before it ended in a musk that I couldn't describe but somehow knew. It wasn't overpowering, but somehow all that was familiar was wrong. For the first few steps I watched my footing on the riverbank before looking up again. At first I didn't understand how the sight of a beautiful man across from me felt as familiar as it did disturbing. I swallowed back my desire to call out. The threat of acknowledging him sent sirens off in my mind. Somewhere it'd be a breach of Hutlani and I'd have a debt to spirit to pay. All I could do was back away slowly. No one should be this far near our camp without our noticing. I whistled up for our dog Sutka as I slid back. 1 step. 2 step. 5 step. Ass on the ground. I would later berate myself for being like women in the movies. The hair rose on the back of my arms and my ears felt a warmth over my shoulder. I flipped my eyes to the side to find nothing. I jerked myself back up and 2 men were now on my side of the river with malicious grins. Their scent grew stronger and I was losing my logical grip. The tangy scent caused my mind so much confusion. I wanted to run from them, at the same time it was alluring. There was almost a calming vanilla hidden under it all. That's when a dog barked in the distance and what could be voices were like petals on the wind, barely able to be grasped. I shook my head back to reality. No one could hear me. It took everything for me to not shudder as I recognized the hair and fur in unfamiliar places. I'd seen it before and had it described many times and recognized them as kushtaka. As embarrassing as it sounds. Yes, I was terrified of fucking beaver men. Beaver. Men. Not were wolf men. Beaver men. My brain was screaming every expletive it could at them. Me living in the city for so long I could barely bring myself to admit the irony of the situation. Of being a grown-ass woman afraid of a beaver. Yes, their bites tear and destroy flesh, but it still sounds embarrassing. I backed away as quickly as I could while watching the blank eyes come closer as movement increased out of the corners of my eyes. As wary as I was of the more obvious danger, I couldn't help but eye the river. Why did the river have to change course now? Why did it seem to foam and swirl in stronger eddies? How could it suddenly move so much faster? I felt myself shaking and the knife in my hand seemed childish. Being overpowered, outnumbered, and about to be treated in God knows what manner. Were women treated as brood maras? Was everyone killed quickly or slowly? Or would I be lucky enough to just be toyed with and allowed home like in the lucky stories? I slashed my knife out at one of the men nearest me and slid as far sideways around a tree as I could before another drastically shortened the distance between us. The playful looks could be considered just that, if I didn't feel like they were from a sociopath finding fun in tearing off the wings off of a butterfly. His eyes were almost pitch black and the minimal whites were almost red with vessels. They were just as soulless as any other rodent ready to tear things apart. A hand gripped me by the back of the neck. Treating me like a puppy with their scruff, the world turned sideways as I was suddenly dragged along the ground. I screamed and struggled as the earth dug into my chest and legs. I think he even smacked my face into a few roots on purpose. I was pulled upright by my neck and hair only to have my mouth quieted by a leathery hand. I stared into blown-out pupils. I still couldn't decide if his look was hazardous or playful. Maybe it depended on who you were in that situation, and I quickly realized which I was. The impish smirk held no humanity, and I waited as he stared, searchingly, at me. It took only a few heartbeats before I heard a voice, raspy with disuse behind me, saying, "Does the river love you better than your mother?" I couldn't understand anything more than the sudden water hitting my back and flooding my mouth. I was in the now raging river, rolling and tumbling with no way to get my bearings. It may have been a minute or only seconds before I could break the surface again. I gasped as deeply as I could before turning to face what I expected was downstream. The water foamed over my head and I felt a jerking hand on my right leg before hitting the riverbed, at least 2.5 to 3 meters below me. I got caught on a branch and felt the river pushing against me, never releasing its hold. It was like a giant hand held me pressed against this solid piece of wood and didn't want to let me go. I continued in panic and struggled before final release, only to hit a rock a meter later and feel the shock go from my leg through my whole body. I screamed and water flowed into my mouth, trying to take any bit of life from me. I turned into a ball to try and right myself when my back was dragged against the riverbed. Sharp rocks and roots dug into it, trying to make purchase and hold me there. I was beginning to lose the last hope of surfacing when my fingers broke free of the water. The heave of air I had was full of spray, yet I couldn't have asked for more. Briefly, I thought the movement in the corner of my eye was debris before I felt a body hugging my back and laughter in my ear. I had a moment of reprieve as whatever it was said something in Koyukon and paused. I knew they were waiting for a response and I regretted not paying attention to my elders. I felt frustration in their chest as they shoved me away and something else pulled my hair down. I reached and pleaded for the surface as I once again hit root and rubble. This time I was caught. I wanted to thank my lucky stars. I wanted to thank the gods. I wanted to thank Raven and every Aina I could. Instead, I screamed my first full gasp of water as my arm broke between branches. I couldn't move. My arm was caught and tears would be streaming down my face if I weren't underwater. Struggle as I might, the river was too powerful. So I hung by my broken arm. As hard as I pulled and kicked, the river wouldn't let me go. It almost goaded me as I felt my other fingertips reach roots from the bank, momentary safety less an arm length away. I felt teasing as if my broken arm would be released and my head shoved down many times. It may have been only twice, but it felt as if it were hundreds. Every scream shoved more water down my throat. During one of my screams, I felt fingers shoved into my mouth. They held my tongue down almost like a lever, only to force more water down my throat. As quickly as it started, though, something pulled my shoulders and suddenly I was free. The river shoved me to the bottom, but I was able to rebound to the surface, now finding it barely a meter deep and slower than before. Breaching it, I gasped and screamed. My relief was short-lived as once again I felt a body holding my back. This time they held my forehead, so my head was forced to look up and I heard a deep voice in English. "Breathe deep, little one. For your sake, never come back." I felt a searing pain and almost tearing through the muscle in my shoulder, then heard laughter from around me. Then my head was shoved under again. This time I remember only my head cracking in pain on the now shallow riverbed. It's been several years now. Aunties use my story to teach how important it is not to play along the water alone. After all, even adults can be hurt by it. It took 2 days before I was found only a couple of miles from my home. Body beaten and broken. No one ever commented how there were marks of handprints all over my body, or the abnormal bites along my shoulder. I'd have much preferred being a warning against abuse than a victim of the river. I'll stay along the main body of the Yukon, but never in it. My family calls me lazy because I never come back for fishing season. I don't care. I don't want to find out if I was saved by the river or by the bodies that pulled me around like a doll. I don't think either of them cared. I don't know which of the stories of the Kushtaka are real. I don't know if they were saving me or were the monsters trying to kill me. My aunts will always make the children believe I was pulled away to teach me a lesson to never be alone by the river. Still, my father and stepmother make it sound as if the Kushtaka were saving me from the river that had drawn in my mother. As if they were bullies on the playground who had gone a step too far and tried to correct their mistake. But I know it's not that they were bullies or truly trying to kill me. Not their mischief getting out of hand and trying to correct it. It's that they're the guardians of the river, a sibling protecting it from heartbreak. The river was looking for the one that got away, and they'll never find it. The one that got away is long gone, somewhere in the spring snow. And I'll only be the tail skirts it reaches for.